We're going to preview the Esports World Cup today because with the amount of money on the line and the number of teams involved, I think most, if not all teams, are treating this as the biggest Overwatch event of the year. And as such, I thought it would be really good to look at the format, how it's going to work, and also preview the teams so we can get an idea for what the storylines are going into the event, the strengths and weaknesses of the particular teams, and all of that. But before we get into detail of the teams, I want to talk about the format, because there's quite a few things that this event is doing differently than a lot of Overwatch events we've seen in the past, particularly OWCS we've seen so far this year. But one thing they aren't doing differently is prize money. As you would expect, there's a lot of money on the line, $1 million total, and the money goes up pretty significantly every time you get through. If you come last and you go out in groups, you'll be in this bottom tier, but if you get out of groups, you jump up to this one. If you win the next round, you jump up to this one. And then you jump up to this one. And as you can see, your money's actually doubling all the way. And even if you get first place, your money actually more than doubles, 250% from that second to first win, as well as there also being 50 grand up for grabs for the tournament MVP. So a lot of money on the line, which is why there's so much focus from so many of the teams going into this. The format itself is going to start pretty straightforwardly. As you can see, we've got all of our teams here in 4 groups of 4. All of these 4 groups will play a round robin, which is where every team in the group plays every other team in the group, and then that will sort them into some kind of first, second, third, and fourth place order. So the fourth place teams are going straight out. They will play no more than those 3 games, kicked out of the tournament and finish in those bottom places. For the other teams, the first place out of each group will go straight to the quarterfinals, so they'll get to skip around, and as such will also get, with the way the schedule works, they'll get a day off, which I'm sure they'll be very appreciative of in terms of preparing and relaxing and getting ready for their big quarterfinal game. The second place teams will all go into this round 1 spot. Now, it doesn't matter where in the bracket they go because they're going to be drafted later on. So what these second place teams do in this round 1 is they will get to draft from all the third place teams in all the groups, and that will give us our round 1 matchups. Then obviously these round 1 games will be played, which means 4 teams will progress and 4 teams will be eliminated. From the 4 teams that progress, so everyone who wins out of round 1 and goes forward, the quarterfinal teams will then draft from those 4 teams, which will give us our final top 8 bracket. And then from there, it will play like a standard elimination bracket all the way through to the grand final where we'll get a winner. Now, a few things that are slightly different. All of the games in the group stage are going to be best of 5, like we're pretty used to seeing for most Overwatch tournaments. But all the games in this playoff section are going to be single elimination, but they are going to be best of 7, which means we'll obviously see some very big series, and even though it's single elimination, so there are no second chances for teams, we're going to have bigger matches, more maps in play, and that should hopefully mean the best team does keep going through. But of course, with it being single elimination, it does add a certain level of peril and anxiety to every single one of these matches once we get through to this playoff bracket. The other thing worth mentioning in terms of the schedule is on the Wednesday and Thursday, so the 24th and 25th of July, that's when we're going to do the entire group stage. And this will be a jam-packed day of Overwatch action. And then once we get to the playoffs, it will be a round per day. So all of round 1 will happen on one day. Then all the quarterfinals will happen on the next day. So this will be Friday and this will be Saturday. And then these final 3 matches will all happen on the Sunday for our big grand finale of everything. So it'll be a very exciting final day, and all the from Friday onwards, all the matches are going to be so high stakes. I think everything's going to be a pretty do or die, very exciting matches going on. Another large difference between this tournament and previous tournaments is the introduction of hero bans. So we've seen map bans before and map picks before. We're going to still have that. They're going to use the same system as they did at the Dallas Major, where the loser picks the map and also gets to pick from the mode. So you can pick either from hybrid or push or flashpoint. We can do the modes in any order. It won't be fixed, just like it was at the Dallas Major. But an additional thing that the loser will also be able to pick is the bans. Both teams will get a single ban each per map, and the loser of the previous map will get to pick the order the bans happen in. So do they want to be the team that bans first, or would they want to be the team that bans second? So a pretty big advantage from losing the previous map. Now, the bans themselves, there's a few rules to try and make this as fair and even as possible. The way the bans work is you'll get 1 ban per map per team. So if we go into our first map, Team A might choose to ban Lucio or something like that, and then Team B gets to pick for another hero to ban in that map. But Team B cannot pick a hero that's the same role as one that has already been banned. So if Lucio is banned, no support characters can be banned by the second team. And likewise, if it was a DPS, no DPS characters could be banned by the second team. So you can only have one hero per role banned per map. Now, as we move throughout the series, if we move from map 1 to map 2, what will happen is all the heroes will be enabled again. All the heroes are playable, and we will do another series of bans. So one team might ban first, and again, they might ban maybe, let's say, Bastion for whatever reason, and then the second team won't be able to ban from DPS, but they can ban another hero from either support or tank. Now, you can't repeat bans that you've made in the series. So if you ban Lucio in map 1, you're not able to ban Lucio again in the rest of the series. But the other team could ban Lucio. So for all the heroes in play, you could see it banned up to twice in a total series, once by one team, once by the other team. It should be said that while you can't repeat bans, any hero banned in a map applies to both teams. So if you choose to ban Winston or something, not only is the other team not allowed to play it, you're not allowed to play it either. And hopefully you followed all of that. The other thing to mention as well, and this will affect certainly the bigger rosters, is that the roster selection and submission process will happen after the bans. So you can't have a situation where maybe Hanbin gets subbed in and then you try and ban the Hanbin heroes. What will happen is, in this situation, Falcons will be able to choose their roster after the ban, so they could put either Smurf or Hanbin in, depending on what comps they think are viable after those bans. So there's a lot of details to that, but I think it does add a big level of strategic depth, a lot of impact the coaches can have now in terms of setting up the series and setting up their team for success, or maybe even sabotaging the enemy team. So I'd be really excited to see this unfold live for the first time at the Esports World Cup. Now, with all of that in mind, I want to start taking a look at some of the teams in question. So we're going to preview all of the teams, and we're going to go in seed order as that seems fairest. Okay, so we'll start with Crazy Racoon.
But live! Even the devil looked away in disgust!
It's fair to say 2024 has been the year of the Racoon so far. While everyone thought at the start of the year it was going to be all about Team Falcons, the Korean super team to end all super teams. But actually, as we've gone through the year, it's been Crazy Racoon who have had all their success. Despite supposedly not having first access to all the talent that Falcons did, they've crafted a roster with some of the most experienced and successful players from Overwatch League, with a couple of once promising players who had a bit of a disaster season on the San Francisco Shock. And those two players are, of course, Junbin and Heesang, who have really gone from strength to strength this year. I think a lot of people really weren't buying into the hype that they had pre-Overwatch League Season 6 after they were signed to the Shock, and really did quite poorly throughout. But this year, they've really redeemed themselves, and it felt like at the Dallas Major, with Crazy Racoon winning it, that was the completion of the redemption story for the two young Korean players. Alongside the Dallas Major success, they've also won OWCS Korea, and they won the Asia LAN as well. Now, obviously qualified from that Dallas Major, now they'd also go on to win. So it's been a year of success for Crazy Racoon, and they'll be hoping to go from strength to strength as they move into the Esports World Cup here. Now, there are obviously some different aspects to the Esports World Cup in terms of the hero bans, and I could throw them a few curveballs, but I actually think this roster is incredibly well suited to hero bans. A lot of their players are very flexible. Also, we look at someone like Junbin, who has the pocket pick in the version of Ball, can make Crazy Racoon quite a hard team to ban around, because while you might see a lot of teams trying to take Dive away from a lot of the Korean teams, suddenly if you ban Winston to try and get rid of Dive, well, actually, what if Junbin just goes Ball and can cause you just as many problems? It can prove a real headache, I think, for teams who want to try and move around the Dive matchup as much as they can against Crazy Racoon. So I think this makes them pretty well suited to this type of system. Another thing that I think is a big strength for them is that they have a clear identity. It really feels like the coaching staff of Moon, Pavan, and Kong have carved out a clear identity as this hyper-aggressive, always pushing small advantages team. And I think having this kind of clear identity will really help in a hero ban system, because with a hero ban system, you're going to have to adapt a lot. You're going to have to be making on-the-fly comp changes and hero selections and all of this, which means you might not be quite as rehearsed or well drilled on the comps as you normally would be. But if you have a clear style, now we're always going to play aggressive, we're always going to try and fight in spawn where we can, we're going to take early fights, we're going to be willing to commit ults to clutch and everything like this, it actually means you can apply these things to all the comps you play. So it means even if there's a lot of moving parts and potentially some confusion, you can still rely on this core identity. So I think that'll be a big strength for them. And even though we have seen that aggression and the holding in spawn sometimes backfire on them, I think overall it's a net positive for the team, and it's something that other teams have clearly struggled to deal with. Alongside that, their biggest strengths are obviously players like Lip and Shu, who both really seem at the top of their field, much like Heesang, Jumpman and Trong all are. But Lip and Shu are putting particularly high levels of performances. It still feels like Shu is the guy on Ana. If you're going to take any kind of Ana matchup in, no matter who you are, even if you're fielder, it's not going to work out for you. Shu's going to find a way to gap you, to hit more nades, to deal with the traitor a little bit better, hit a couple more sleeps, and really give his team the advantage. But one of the big things I think that has improved for Shu since some of his time in Overwatch League is it feels like his Kiriko has really come on quite a long way. And now, especially after watching a lot of it in the Dallas Major final, in some of these Malga mirrors, it really feels like he's reached a new level and is able to maybe play this hero to the same level we expect from Shu on all heroes. Likewise, Lip is really starting to cement his place as a really top-tier candidate for the greatest of all time, with the success that's now coming with this latest iteration of the roster, and a win at the Esports World Cup here will be very much on his mind. But we do have to talk about some of the weaknesses for Crazy Racoon as well, and they're pretty limited, let's be honest. They've got a very talented roster, a very talented coaching staff, and all the momentum is in their favour. But one particular meta that might cause them some issues, and it's kind of what we saw at the Dallas Major, is a double flex DPS meta. Now, while Lip is probably one of the greatest hit scans of all time, on flex DPS he doesn't have the same impact, especially when you start looking at some of these other teams like Falcons, who have Proper and Stalker, and also a lot of the other teams who just have bigger rosters and have a second flex DPS player they can sub in. So if the meta does lean that way, it could cause them problems. I think it is worth remembering, while they won that Dallas Major final against Falcons, they did lose a lot of the Malga mirror when Falcons were able to play double flex DPS, and they were able to force Lip off the Cassidy role, off any kind of hit scan. So if that problem comes up again, it's a problem Crazy Racoon might have to solve. Ultimately, what got them past the post in that Dallas Major final was their ability to pull out dive and pull out the ball comp on certain areas as well. So obviously they still have that, and that's a good thing, but I think certainly double flex DPS seems like it's something that might come into play a lot more and continue like it did in the Dallas Major. And that could be a bit of a tricky situation for Crazy Racoon. Likewise, you can maybe make the argument if there was any sort of double flex support. While Charong is a very flexible main support as far as they go, and in many ways this is an advantage, still you would imagine he's not able to reach the same level as certain other rosters when they have someone like Violet, or they just have a second flex DPS player as well. So a few more of these specialist directions that the meta could go in could cause Crazy Racoon some problems. So we'll have to see how they deal with that and how they approach it. But ultimately, I think it has to be said, they've dealt with those weaknesses before. They dealt with them at the Dallas Major. They got past a double flex DPS meta, which in theory should have been the hardest meta for them to beat Falcons in, and they still did it. So I think Crazy Racoon, definite favourites for this tournament. They're a fun team to watch. They're super aggressive. The biggest question mark is maybe how they handle going in now as heavy favourites. It felt like the original dynamic versus Falcons was that Falcons were kind of the big dog. They were the team with the most money, the biggest name behind them, the most resources, all of this. So it felt like Crazy Racoon were kind of punching up. Now Crazy Racoon are the clear favourite. It'll be interesting to see how they manage those expectations going through what can be quite a high peril tournament as single elimination. Saying all that though, if you had to ask me for a prediction where they'll finish in first place.
And these birds of prey move one notch up the food chain.
A team that is, of course, looking to stop the Crazy Racoon is Team Falcons. They were the original super team this year. They were meant to dominate a post-Overwatch League world. But really, despite winning OWCS Korea all the way back at the start of the year, since then they've come runner-up to Crazy Racoon twice, both at the Asia LAN and the Dallas Major. And as such, all the memes are coming back. Proper always second, can't win a major championship or a major title. All of these things are now starting to get associated with Falcons as well. Always second fiddle. Always the bridesmaid, never the bride. And this is the big problem for Falcons. Even though by most team standards they've had a very successful year, they've beaten every other team except for Crazy Racoon consistently. Because they keep coming second, and because of the resources and everything that was poured into the roster, and the talent they do have on the roster, it's really come first or it's not good enough for Falcons. And especially as we approach the Esports World Cup, the biggest event of the year for most of these teams, it has to be said, this is the one to get it right. And this is the one to finally take down Crazy Racoon and throw off the shackles of forever second. And ultimately, I think I look at this roster and it's hard to pick too much fault with it. They've got so much experience on the roster. All of them have had success in one form or another before. And it feels like they should have all the ingredients, especially when we start to think about a hero ban system where you might have to play a large variety of comps, a few different things, or adapt on the fly. There's so much knowledge and experience, and also quite a lot of leaders, especially when we look at like Chio and both Proper in this lineup, where you feel like there should be enough direction both within the team and outside, well, within the server and outside the server, in the form of a coaching staff as well, to help see them through any potential comp they have to play. And it has to be said, we have seen a few different looks from Falcons already. As much as Crazy Racoon have a few of their niche picks, I think it's fair to say Falcons have played a pretty wide spectrum of comps across the year. We saw him play the aggressive double flex DPS, obviously at the Dallas Major to great success, and all the way back at the start of the year, we've also seen him play some sim-based comps and do lots of TP rotations and all this kind of stuff, and maybe very London-esque or SSG look as well. So it really feels like they have a huge range of options to choose from. The big problem will, of course, when you have so many options to choose from, is you have to try and pick the right one. One thing that you have to say, though, at the Dallas Major, I think they got the meta read correct. They played the Mauga comp, they played it with double flex DPS. It felt like this was ultimately the best version of that comp available at the time. We saw Crazy Racoon try and adapt to it, try and keep lip on Cass as long as they could, but ultimately it felt like they couldn't do that. We saw him then having to swap off onto flex DPS himself, and that is obviously where you would have to say Team Falcons have a clear advantage over Crazy Racoon if they can play a double flex DPS mirror. And while it did pay dividends, ultimately Falcons weren't able to handle some of the more niche picks. They weren't able to handle the ball comp from jump in. The hog threw them for a loop all the way at the start on Oasis. So they got thrown off by a few curveballs that they'll have to try and be ready for. And in a world with hero bans, there's going to be more curveballs thrown by all these teams. So Falcons do have to find a way to deal with all of this. And if they can't do that, obviously the perils of single elimination might cost them. One thing that has to be said, though, is they have the players to deal with all these things. I think when you look at Proper and Stalker, I don't think you can really ask for a much better DPS combo. I think, while Proper is still the man in all these situations, both on hitscan and flex DPS, and I think he proved that at the Dallas Major, at least that he still got it on flex DPS, even though he's played a lot of the year on hitscan. I think Stalker has been the real star of this team, just slowly, quietly being super successful on everything they ask him to do. When he was playing Venture, had so much impact in all of those series, and I think really set the bar for how much you can get done on that hero, and a big reason why we saw more teams adapting it as they went on. I think if we start to look at some of the problems the roster have had, it is certainly maybe more with the tank line. It feels like Smurf has had less consistency than he has had historically, meaning we still get a lot of good performances, but we also get some that feel like they really go and miss. This is something that really hasn't been a characteristic of Smurf before, but it feels like that's been a potential weak point for them. So while Smurf seems to be trending down in terms of his average performance, tank like Jumbin on the side of Crazy Racoon certainly seems to be trending up. And as such, we've maybe seen a little bit of changing of the guard there in terms of who the best tank is. Obviously, Team Falcons have Hanbin on the roster as well, but with the way the meta has gone, it really feels like Hanbin has been relegated this year to just playing a secondary role, getting occasional maps, but for the most part, actually just playing the same heroes as Smurf, just on 1 or 2 maps in the series rather than the sort of 3 or 4 we see from Smurf. So it does feel like potentially if meta does lean Hanbin's way, that could just circumvent some of these issues for Falcons. Other than that, we just need to see maybe Smurf have a good tournament at the right time. The other thing that has to be brought into question is the fateful Gibraltar from that Dallas Major final, where they went pretty even on dive during their defense, and then they swapped to Mauga into dive on their attack against the Crazy Racoon, and it went horrifically. It very much felt like this was an on-the-fly decision, not something they had prepared. And with hero bans in play, these sort of on-the-fly decisions are the ones they're going to be having to make more often in every series, if not in every map. So there maybe has to be a bit of a question mark to how they handle those things, because if they can't handle them well, they probably will have a bad time ultimately. But I think overall how I feel about Falcons is if they can get the right meta, they can beat Crazy Racoon. They have beaten them in series before. And I think if I look at the Dallas Major, not just from the result, but I look at it from, say, a Team Falcons perspective, where Team Falcons come in, they get what seems to ultimately be the correct meta read in terms of Mauga and double flex DPS. They have the perfect roster for that as well, in the form of Proper and Stalker as their DPS combo, and also the perfect meta actually give them a distinct advantage over Crazy Racoon. And then you tell me now they're also going to play it better than all the other teams. Well, great. That should put them in a great position to win the tournament. Ultimately, they got thrown off in the grand finals and weren't able to handle the picks for Crazy Racoon. I think you have to say Crazy Racoon do still deserve it on balance, but if I'm Team Falcons, I shouldn't take that as necessarily a bad sign in terms of how they prepared for the event and how they went into the event. The question is just how they can deal with these curveball picks that teams might be willing to run against them. The other thing to factor in for Falcons is, at what point does this become more of a mental battle versus Crazy Racoon? They've now come second to them twice. Is it going to start to become a bit of a mental block for them? Is there going to be issues once we get to the crunch time of series where they're not able to find their way through, or this doubt creeps in, or they maybe second guess some of their swaps after some of the mistakes they've made in the past? So while I think Falcons clearly have all the talent to win this tournament, and that is definitely what they will be aiming for, they've still got a lot to prove. Now the label of forever second is not one that they deserve to hold, and that they can do it when it matters most.
Violet again finding the killing blow on him as Flora comes up with 2.
The third seed coming into this tournament is ZETA Division, a team that really does fit the archetype of Korean super team, but maybe hasn't been on the radar as much for most people, mainly because while they finished third at the Asia LAN, it meant they didn't qualify for the Dallas Major, so they didn't get the opportunity to come and perform against the other regions and perhaps show how dominant they might have been, similar to their comrades in Crazy Racoon and Team Falcons. But if we look back at their games that they did play against those two dominant Korean teams at the Dallas Major, they were mostly pretty competitive, especially against Team Falcons. So I think it's fair to say that ZETA Division stand a real good chance of being the true third seed in terms of power level, and also being particularly dominant over a lot of the Western teams. When we start to look at some of the strengths for ZETA Division here, it has to be Burner we talk about first. I think if you watch any of those OWCS Korea games or the Asia LAN, it was really him as the standout performer. The problems they ran into were, of course, the fact that he didn't have a Winston, but on the heroes that he did play, a lot of Zarya, a lot of Orisa, a bit of Sigma, he was lights out. Really a standout performer. So if a meta is one where they can get Burner into the starting lineup consistently, I think ZETA Division have a great chance here. Especially maybe when we look at Falcons and we talk about some of their faltering problems with Smurf or lack of consistency. I think Burner, every time he plays, he seems to put in an A-star performance. And on top of that, they've also added Fearless to the roster. So you have to ask the question with Fearless, how much has he played recently? Is he still the Fearless we remember from season 6? Or has there been some kind of fall off? The presumption obviously is that he either is still at the same level or will get back to the same level by the time the tournament starts, at which point you have to look at this tank lineup as a pretty well-rounded and complete tank lineup, in all honesty. On top of that, they have a lot of players who have shown really high potential in the past, but maybe haven't quite fulfilled it. Alpha Yi is probably the best example of this, a player that lots of people said should have been considered for MVP in Season 6, but was on the Washington Justice, who ultimately didn't go very far at all in any really portion of that year in Overwatch League. But a super high talent player, as good a flex DPS as anyone else you're going to see in this tournament, and really the X factor who can put ZETA Division over the top in some of these big games. Now, it has to be said, the biggest thing for Alpha Yi is still needs to prove it, right? We talked about the tournaments earlier in the year where ZETA Division did well, but weren't able to finish ahead of Falcons or Crazy Racoon. ZETA Division are a team with enough talent, enough expectations, enough about them, where they really have to be considering, can they win the tournament? Can they finish first place? And if you want to do that, you need your star players to play well, and Alpha Yi will need to play well and play at his best to help push this team over the edge. Now, one of the other strengths they have is Violet. While we've seen Violet be, fair to say, a liability at times in Lucio, and he has played predominantly Lucio this year, as we enter a world of hero bans, all of a sudden, Lucio might start getting taken out of the lineup more often, or might be less viable based on other bans as well, which means we might see Lucio's having to flex over to other heroes. And one thing that Violet can do better than any other main support on the go is playing those flex support heroes, whether it's Alari or Kiri Even his Brig is also very good as well. But Violet's flexibility means he's not just capable or competent on these other heroes, he can be a carry on these heroes. And that is something that not a lot of other teams have the same access to. And certainly not a lot of the other teams have the same access to in the player who is also their primary Lucio player. So a huge advantage there from Zeta Division from a more tactical perspective. But we'll have to wait and see how Zeta Division, if they can set up situations where they can get the most out of Violet's flexibility. But if they do, they probably actually have a pretty good advantage. And maybe if we think about particular matchups, maybe later in the competition, against Crazy Racoon, if I had to pit, say, a Violet Illari versus a Trong Illari or Zen v Zen or anything like that, I mean, I have to favour Violet by a large margin. So if they can find ways to set that up or the meta lends itself to that, this could be a huge advantage for Zeta Division to exploit as we go through this tournament. On the other side of the support lineup is, of course, Finn, a player that people have been somewhat critical of as lately, probably in particular from a disappointing Season 6 on the San Francisco Shock, which has obviously come up a lot in this video so far, but Finn was also another player who suffered during that season, and while played at the Overwatch World Cup after that, was really a bit part player for Team Korea. But I think there's been a bit of a redemption for Finn in this as well. Maybe not as high-key as Heesang and Jumbin's redemption, but a more low-key redemption for Finn. I think he's put in very respectable performances across the year. I think in particular his BAP has actually looked one of the best in the region. And I think Finn is certainly at least trending back towards maybe some of the potential he initially showed when he first signed for the San Francisco Shock in Season 5. Obviously, the competition is high, but I think all of a sudden when I look at Finn and Violet as an original big question mark for this roster, I think they've proven that they are more than competent and one of the better backlines going into this tournament. The big question mark for me in this roster, though, has to be Flora. I think there's two main questions to ask. The one is maybe obvious, and the same one we're going to apply to a lot of hit scans we talk about, which is what happens if the meta leans away from hit scan? Or what happens on certain maps where they want to play Tracer Echo? Ilios is the obvious example, right? And Flora has to play Tracer. How does that stack up to teams that have either more flexible players or bigger rosters where they can exploit this? Suddenly it then feels like Flora doesn't match up. And I think if we're being honest, in my personal opinion at least, even when we talk about hit scan matchups, while I think Flora is still very good, I'm not sure he enters the elite tier. And I'm not sure how he will perform when put up against some of the best. So I think Flora is probably the biggest question mark for me on this roster in terms of how he will perform. Can he go toe-to-toe with his counterparts? And that will be a problem that can really only be solved in the server or proven wrong in the server. So a lot of pressure on Flora being what for me feels like the obvious weak link in Zeta Division, and we'll have to see how he gets on throughout this. The other big worry I have for Zeta Division as a whole is the wacky comps they play throughout the year. It really felt like a lot of the time it wasn't a problem with the players or the execution. It just seemed like a comp problem for the most part, and they would just be on something wacky and kind of just stick it and then just lose, and it would feel like a very disappointing use of all the talent they have on the roster. So there's a big question mark of if they were mismanaging some of the situations in potentially a simpler system with no hero bans, how are they going to handle a more complicated situation? Now, the other side of this is obviously the fact the coaching staff has changed completely, right? So we're going to see a very different approach, but it has to be said, we really hope that they have a more concrete read and a more concrete plan on how they want to deal with these hero bans and these different situations, what comps they want to play, because the roster is certainly talented, so it'd be a shame to see it go to the waste as it felt like it did sometimes earlier in the year when they were on some weird and, I was going to say weird and wonderful, but maybe just more weird than wonderful comps. So a lot of positives, a lot of promise and potential for Zeta Division, but we need to see it come to fruition. They have a roster that in many ways is as well-rounded as Falcons, maybe even in slightly less players. The only big issue is obviously Flora if there is a double flex DPS meta or something. Same problem that Crazy Racoon have with Lip. So that's a big positive for them. There's obviously a lot of questions to be asked of how do they look under this new coaching staff? Do they look better? Do they look worse? How do they handle these new hero ban systems and all of this? But I think there's lots of reason to be excited for Zeta Division. It'll be nice to see Fearless play again. There's a lot of another opportunity to see Burner play again. I think people will be pleasantly surprised by how well Finn and Violet operate as a backline. So I think there's lots of reason to be excited about Zeta Division. Whether they can hit the dizzying heights that they maybe hope for in this roster in terms of getting to the finals or even winning it, there's a lot of questions to answer before that. But I think ZETA Division, a roster to be very excited about.
Put your hands together for Space Station Gaming!
Our fourth seed is Space Station Gaming, the best in the West. The long-standing core of the London Spitfire have added some key high-talent pieces in the form of Psycho and Funny Astro to their roster for 2024, and it served them very well. Despite a stumble in Stage 1 of OWCS, they won Stage 2, they won the FACEIT playoffs, and they were the highest placing Western team at the Dallas Major, of course, cementing themselves as truly the best in the West. However, the nature of how they lost that Dallas Major, I think really does leave a sour taste in a lot of their mouths in terms of their performance against some of the star-studded Korean teams, and they certainly will be looking to close the gap at this event. A big ask, but one that is certainly their main goal. Historically, the London Spitfire have always been a team that had very high peaks on Ryan and Symmetra, and a lot of creativity in taking the Brawl matchup, particularly against Dive. What the Space Station version of this roster has done is they've taken those, kept those high peaks, and tried to broaden the types of compositions they can play. Psycho being a key part of that, adding a high-level Tracer, Echo, and in general covering a lot of the hero pool weaknesses in that London Spitfire roster, which means they can now play Dive and have a lot of success on Dive, and especially when we look at their results within EMEA, a lot of that success has come through playing the Dive matchup, and in general being able to basically just counter-comp what teams, especially like ENCE, want to do in a lot of situations. So the broadness of their compositional spectrum has really risen, and it's given them a lot of success. But the big problem is obviously, while they do have that option against a lot of their domestic competition, Twisted Minds, ENCE, and so on, their ability to do the same thing against maybe a Toronto Defiant, or obviously a lot of the elite Korean teams that have an elite Dive, means suddenly that Dive option might be off the cards, which means Space Station's route past some of these top teams at the event, particularly the top Korean teams, might actually be more of a London Spitfire style victory, where they use their Brawl and maybe some of Orion, some of Symmetra to get past those teams. I want to talk about the additions they made to the roster for this year, because I think they've both been very good signings. I think Funny Astro is just a top tier main support and has added a lot just in terms of raw quality and cooling and all of this. Psycho, on the other hand, I think has really opened up their options, and especially as we go into a ban system, I think Psycho is going to be invaluable. Not only does he have flexibility within his own hero pool, what this allows is it also allows them to play a lot of double flex DPS compositions with both Psycho and Backbone in, or if they ever need a situation where maybe Lucio is banned, which is one of the most talked about bans against Space Station, suddenly maybe that enables Backbone to reprise his role as Boneback and fill in on flex support or something like this, and work around some of these Lucio bans in more difficult maps, and they can play Psycho and Sparker instead. Likewise, Spark actually has a pretty good Tracer as far as hit scans go, which means even with Psycho and Spark in, they can play some versions of a double flex DPS if it comes to that as well. So actually a lot of flexibility on this roster, especially considering the sort of Brawl one-trick narrative that sometimes follows a lot of these EMEA teams around. They've actually got a lot of depth and different options. The big problem, though, is obviously going to be when they do run into this Dive. And if we look at the map pool from the Esports World Cup, it is actually quite Dive-favoured. So they could find themselves, they have to be quite clever with how they go through the map picks and what modes they select and eliminate when they get that option, just to try and circumvent some of these Dive maps, because there are a lot of good ones, and especially once we get to some of the top Korean teams, as we've talked about, this could start to be a problem for them. The nature of that as well means they might be a little bit patch dependent or meta dependent. If we do find ourselves in a hard Dive meta, can they use the hero bans to their advantage and work around it? Or are they just going to find themselves in a situation where it's quite hard to win a major tournament when the meta doesn't favour them? Which is probably, you can kind of say that for every team, right? But it does mean they will be hoping the meta maybe leans a little bit more towards something they can excel on, rather than being that Dive favoured. The other thing that is worth mentioning as well is the London Spitfire core originally was quite a scripted team in terms of lots of ideas for how to play certain situations, how to play certain maps. With the chaos that hero bans provides in terms of the comps you'll have to play, the comps the enemy teams will be playing, all the different opponents in this event, it is a 16-team event, bigger than most. Can they really be as scripted in this situation? How much are they able to pre-plan and organize, and how much will actually shift from some of this pre-planning to solving the problems in the moment, and how will Space Station fare in those situations. We have seen them adapt in series so far this year. You maybe think about some of their series in the FACEIT playoffs, or even the qualifiers for FACEIT as well, where they had to change mid-series to try and fix things that were going wrong, both against Virtus.Pro and against ENCE. And they were able to do that, so it'll be interesting to see if they can apply the same logic here and the same adaptations here. In terms of how we expect them to do it in this event, I think the gap between Space Station Gaming and the rest of the EMEA teams has actually gotten bigger. Space Station are very much the best team from their own region. I think they're also better than all of the North American teams, except for Toronto Defiant, which will be the closest run one. And obviously, when you look at this ban system, potential that the flexibility that Toronto has contained within the roster will be buffed massively by this hero ban system. And obviously, you think about that Florida core that makes the current Toronto Defiant. They won the Overwatch League playing quite a counter-swappy game, so maybe something with these bans and this flexibility does actually suit them quite well. So, big question marks. Ultimately, that's what will define Space Station's success at this event. We expect them to beat most of the North American teams. We expect them to beat all of the teams from their own region, but how do they do against these elite Korean teams? How do they do against Toronto Defiant? Because remember, even at the Dallas Major, as much as they finished above Toronto Defiant, ENCE took care of Toronto for them. They never had to beat Toronto themselves. So Space Station Gaming will really be judged by how they do against Toronto and how they do against these elite Korean teams. The Dallas Major, I think they'll agree with this as well, wasn't good enough in terms of the performances they put in those maps. So this will be the big test for them, the biggest event for the year for them and all the players, and ultimately a big test of both their flexibility and their ability to deal with these elite Korean rosters.
It looks like Yeti is playing like the stronger team here. But
our 5th seed is Fnatic, who are also the 4th and lowest ranked Korean team coming to this event as well. And while they might be the lowest ranked Korean team, they still come in with pretty high expectations. They're a very high talent roster. Maybe they don't have the same experience level as a lot of the other elite Korean rosters we see, but the talent level on this roster is very high, including players like Donghak, Knife, Viper. Players we've seen have very high individual performances, even if maybe with the exception of Donghak, their teams haven't done particularly well. This team had a particularly romantic week in the OWCS Korea qualifying seeding tournament, which was the tournament for the top 4 teams just before the Korea playoffs, where they all played against each other. And during this week, they beat Crazy Racoon, they nearly beat Falcons, they nearly beat FTG. A real performance that put them on the map. Impressed everyone, and they had all their success on the dive composition. Donghak played like a man possessed, and he really looked like the real deal, both on Winston, as we maybe would expect, but also on Doomfist, a hero that he maybe quite infamously didn't do very well on against London Spitfire at the end of Season 6. Now, they took all of this talent. We saw Knife playing more of a hit scan. We saw Viper going off on Tracer. Everything was really working for them, and they can maybe even count themselves kind of unlucky not to have won more of those 3 games. But as we moved into the OWCS Korea playoffs themselves and the Asia LAN that followed, we really saw them come crashing back down to earth. All of a sudden, it didn't seem like they had the same confidence in their dive to play it everywhere. They were trying more composition, some of them quite weird and wacky. Ultimately, though, all of them much less successful than their dive. So either they lost confidence in their dive during scrims that week, or the meta maybe just shifted away from them. So a real mixed bag with this team where we've sort of seen dizzying highs, but in a very small period of time, and they've not really been able to follow it since. Likewise, with this team, we've also not seen them play since those OWCS Asia LAN finals, which was quite a while ago at this point. Since then, they've made a series of changes. Coaches Fate and Fleta have called up their old Shanghai Dragon friends, and they've got Izayaki and Lee Jae-gong to join the roster and replace the Bliss Irony backline, which I think everyone has to agree probably is an upgrade. But the caveat to this is Izayaki and Lee Jae-gong have actually had pretty terrible 2024s, especially by their standards. Izayaki having a hopeless attempt at the ROC Esports roster over in EMEA. Lee Jae-gong having a pretty disappointing run in OWCS Korea with Runaway. But we know these are talented players. They come with a lot of experience. What version will we get? Will we get something closer to the Shanghai Dragons highs that they once had? Or will we get something maybe a little bit similar to how they performed so far this year? It's hard to say without seeing this in action, but they're maybe not as guaranteed high performers as they maybe once were. Likewise, they've also brought in Checkmate, who's in a similar situation where literally won the Overwatch League. Clearly a very talented flex DPS player, but also has had a particularly poor year, also on that ROC Esports team with Izayaki. They've also signed Attack, which while a player with not quite the same reputation as the other 3 signings, is a player who, in theory, does cover all the holes in Donghack's hero pool roster. So I don't know how useful or how much they will use him, but in theory, they've completed the roster quite a lot. I see a lot of similarities between this team and Space Station Gaming, even though they have very different strengths in terms of the compositions they play. I also feel like all these signings have allowed Fnatic to really broaden the heroes and the comps they can play. So maybe some of those weird and wacky compositions they were having to play at the latter stages of the Asia LAN won't be as needed, or will make a little bit more sense with the players they have available here. Likewise, because they have 3 DPS options available, they can do something similar to what we talked about with SSG, where maybe if they have like a Lucio ban and they don't want to put Lee Jae on Brig or something, they can always move one of their DPS players over to play, say, an Alari or something like that as well. So while in theory they have this greater flexibility, I do wonder now, will they actually be as good at these comps, right? And the same way we talk about SSG, it's like, well, now they can play dive, but they probably don't want to dive mirror against the elite Korean teams. Now, in theory, this Fnatic roster has the ability to play more of these ground-based compositions, to utilize attack a little bit more, to use Izzyaki and Lee Jae-gong, and they can put Checkmate even on Mei or something like this to play quite a hard brawl composition. But do they ever want to play those compositions against an ENCE or an SSG or even a Toronto? Probably not. So, very much, same as SSG, might be able to play a wide variety against a lot of their domestic competition. I feel like Fnatic are in a similar boat, where they can maybe play a few more of these compositions than they could previously, but ultimately, their success in this tournament will probably come from the viability of dive. How far can they go with dive? That's where we've seen their highest peak. That's the heroes that suit most of their players. And I think ultimately as well, you probably have to say in a similar boat to Falcons, they would love a double flex DPS meta. As much as Knife has done a pretty decent job on Sojourn from what we've seen so far this year, it's fair to say he probably doesn't stack up to the elite hit scans that a lot of the other top teams boast. And if they can play a double flex DPS composition where even Knife can flex over to one of these heroes like the Echo, like we've seen him do so far this year, or they can even put maybe Checkmate and Viper in and just really commit to the double flex DPS. And that seems where the biggest strength for this team is. And also double flex DPS is often a combo that works quite nicely with a lot of the dive tanks. So it really does seem like so much of their team is geared up to excel at dive and have that be their main focus point. But obviously we have to talk about how that is also a weakness as well. In much the same vein as some people will be very critical of teams like SSG or ENCE for maybe only being able to excel on the ground compositions and being quite counterable. I think you can make the same case for Fnatic. They're just a different type of specialists. If you take the dive away from them, will they really be able to hit the heights, even though they have, in theory, better players for it now? We'll really have to wait and see. So I think, while there's a lot of reason to be excited for Fnatic, we've seen some crazy highs. We expect them to play a lot of dive, and this can be very exciting, especially into a lot of the other regional compositions that we see. I don't think we've seen anything to make them anything more than a bit of a wild card. I really seen this team in a quite similar vein to LGD, the Chinese team, where we've seen them have these crazy high peaks. And if Fnatic peak at the right time, it's only a 5-day tournament. If they have a good 5 days, if dive is viable, we could see them go really far, quite easily get themselves into top 4 or something. But if the meta doesn't suit them, or they're not able to work around the bans well enough to play dive in enough places, then all of a sudden I could see this team actually maybe losing a bit more than people would expect. So I think this is a team they should be excited about. I think they've got a crazy high peak on dive. I think it's Face and Fleta getting the Shanghai boys back together. It should be an exciting team to watch. It should be a fun team to watch. And they're in a great group alongside SSG, Virtus.Pro, and Nightmare as well. So it should be a very competitive group, and we should get a pretty good read on how strong Fnatic are from that group. So a team to keep an eye on, but maybe a team we shouldn't place in the elite Korean category with, say, a crazy Racoon and Falcons, despite that one romantic weekend in March. Coming in seed number 6 is ENCE, a team who have actually got a pretty high seeding thanks to their win over Toronto at the Dallas Major and their relative high finish there as far as the Western teams go. But the main story for ENCE this year has been how they have been forever second to SSG, pushing them close, pushing them all the way. Every single time the match is an absolute barn burner. But every single time ENCE come out second. And it really has left SSG as the main rivals for ENCE so far this year. But we're going to the Esports World Cup. There is not just going to be SSG there. There's going to be a host of other teams as well. So it might not even be that we get an ENCE SSG Classic at this tournament. They've got a lot of other problems to solve, and they've actually had a pretty up and down time of it as of late. It feels like they've not been in the strongest of form, even though they've come and finished second in the FACEIT playoffs. They had to reverse sweep Virtus.Pro. They had a really close series against Gaimin Gladiators as well, and it feels like ENCE maybe have dropped off as we've moved a bit later into the Crimzo era of ENCE. It's also fair to say ENCE have had a lot of changes, and they've got even more changes coming for the Esports World Cup. So some of the changes that have had a little bit of time to bed in is obviously Sky Ripper coming in at flex support. And one of the maybe more surprising announcements from ENCE was that Ghost will not be going to the tournament with them. So Sky will be the primary flex support in pretty much every comp, every situation they want. Likewise, RAC is going to be coming in to replace Massa on loan from NRG, and will be filling in for the length of this tournament only. So, a very new look backline compared to some of the backlines we've seen with ENCE so far this year. And on top of that, they've also had Wimone join as a second flex DPS option. So, a lot's been going on. It's worth noting as well, Chase won't be going to the event. So, even though their roster's very big, they won't have the option of Chase. They do have Mirror, who can maybe deputise some of the roles Chase would play, but you have to feel that's not really going to be a look ENCE are going to be looking to lean into all that often. The biggest strength for this ENCE roster has always been when they can get themselves on a Sigma competition. They get Vessler on his best hero, where he really does honestly still look like the best Sigma in the world, and then you can play something that Kai and Kev can also get work done in, and actually that sort of front three of ENCE is very powerful and very dangerous. The problem is going to be how often can you get them onto those roles versus how often is the map pool or the band, the hero bands, going to shift them onto something a bit less comfortable. But if they can find success with that Sigma composition, or they get a bit fortunate and the meta leans that way and makes it quite viable, even when we saw ENCE losing to the Korean teams at the Dallas Major, it still looked like Vessler was one of the best players on the server, clearly super talented at that role, and can be a real difference maker at the highest possible level. So ENCE will really probably be trying to do everything they can to get Vessler onto those comfort zones. Likewise, going in ENCE's favour, a lot of the signings I think do add a lot. I think as much as you can argue that in the Lucio department, Massa to RAC is probably more a side grade, or maybe even a slight downgrade in a lot of ways. I think when you look at Brig and Lifeweaver and the flexibility that RAC brings within that role, I think actually, in that sense, he's an upgrade over Massa. And especially with the hero bans, undoubtedly teams are going to ban Lucio against ENCE at least, at some point in the series. So RAC having a bit more flexibility might help him come up with a few more creative solutions to some of those problems. Likewise, also the addition of Wimone fills a lot of these flexibility issues. It will allow them to run double flex DPS. Obviously, Kai, while very much good at the hit scan, we've not really seen him excel on Tracer or any of the other flex DPS heroes. So if anything like the Dallas Major meta comes around again and there's a lot of Venture Genji or Tracer Echo, whatever it might be, suddenly having Wimone and Kev in those sort of ones actually gives them a huge advantage over what they had previously. Likewise, they can do a similar thing as we've talked with some of the previous teams, where Wimone can step in, maybe play the Alari or something if Lucio is banned, if they want to play a double flex composition or something. So I think Wimone is actually the best signing, the best addition they brought to this, and it does give them a lot of flexibility to work around hero bans, to work around difficult maps for them. The biggest problem they'll really have is that while they do have Mirror to deputise for some of Vessler's heroes, you have to feel that they don't really want to be opting into a Winston Mirror with Mirror in or anything like that, and they'll still try and play Vessler wherever possible. Maybe the D.Va buffs can subside some of this hero pool problem as well if D.Va is more viable than it once was. Maybe gives them a solution for especially some of the extreme dive maps like Dorado and so forth. But overall, I think a lot of the signings have added a lot of flexibility. So on paper, I think it all makes sense, all sensible decisions from Crimzo and ENCE. The question is obviously going to be, how well do they actually do on these compositions? It's obviously a lot different than some of the stuff they have been playing, and we'll have to wait and see. Likewise, one thing that is true with these bigger rosters is while it gives you big flexibility in terms of we can play any comp, it only gives you flexibility in the sense that you can put that roster in and they can play that comp. For example, if you were to put Wimone and Kevin as a double flex DPS, suddenly if you do need to swap to hit scan, you could probably get Kev to do it, but it's maybe not as optimal obviously are some of the teams that have flexibility built into the roster, maybe more akin to, say, the Falcons DPS lineup, where Stalker and Proper can really cover everything between themselves. Likewise, same would be true if they're subbing in and out any of the supports as well. If they ever have to make mid-map adjustments, this is where they could really run into problems. And this is true for all the teams that have these big rosters that solve the hero ban problem for them. While they can put any combination in, they can't change mid-map if something starts to go wrong or if there's a counter swap. So they have to make sure they're quite prepared in terms of, if we put this roster in, what do they do if they do these swaps, or what do we do if we run into this type of composition? So as much as it is good, I think all these signings make sense for ENCE, and it should in theory make them stronger than we've seen of late. I think it's also not straightforward necessarily now. It's just immediately solves all the problems. Likewise, I think one thing worth mentioning for ENCE is, of course, their form as of late. It feels like Kai hasn't been reaching the same heights we've seen him do previously, and even Kevster, compared to maybe the start of the year, it feels like he's just off the boil slightly. He's still probably the best player on ENCE and one of the best flex DPS in the world, but it feels like for ENCE to really stand a chance to punch up and climb these rankings quite high, they need a vintage Kevster carry the team through everything performance. So I think there's a lot of problems with ENCE, even though there's also a lot of promise with a lot of the signings they've made. A player I also want to highlight is Ramon, who I think is a super high talent player, but hasn't had the chance to really fulfill that promise in a main starting spot or in a pretty prominent role for a major team. So I think this tournament could be super important for Ramon, a big opportunity for him to impress and demonstrate just how good he really is. The other elephant in the room that we have to talk about is, of course, the fact that the vast majority of teams attending the Esports World Cup, especially those in the sort of upper seedings, have all gone to Korea for a boot camp. SSG have gone, Toronto have gone, Virtus.Pro have gone, Gaimin Gladiators have gone, and Twisted Minds have gone. But ENCE have not gone. They have had a boot camp in Finland, and while this is obviously gives them some of the benefits of a boot camp in terms of they get to have everyone together, they get to socialize and hang out and solve problems and be really dedicated and focused to scrimming and preparing for the Esports World Cup, what it doesn't allow them to do is scrim all the Korean teams, and also scrim all the top EMEA and North American teams, as they have also gone to Korea. So ENCE find themselves outside the primary scrim bubble for this tournament, and this could mean they could be behind on their meta read, they won't be getting the same standard of practice, they probably have to scrim against the same teams quite often, probably Nightmare quite a bit, maybe the Oblivion, the new roster they've put together quite a bit, and all of a sudden it means they won't be getting the same level of practice or the same variety of practice. And you think what teams normally do to ENCE when we go to these tournaments is try and play dive versus them. The level of dive practice they're going to be able to have in Finland, with the access to only EMEA teams and what's left in North America and what's left in EMEA, it's not going to be good enough for them. So huge question marks here for ENCE, even though I think they've made a lot of good decisions in terms of their roster additions and how they're trying to build out the roster for hero bans. I think they may be at real risk of getting left behind because of that scrim bubble difference. You combine that with maybe some of their best players aren't in their best form, and we could really start to run into a lot of issues for ENCE here. So I think even though there are some reasons to be excited, and I'm really keen to see how Ramon fits into this roster and how they make use of RAC's slightly bigger hero pool, I do worry that ENCE will get left behind a little bit here by all the teams that did hit that Korea boot camp. So expectation-wise, I think I can still see them coming top 8, particularly if they finish second in their group. All they have to do is beat M80, right, who aren't actively scrimming. So if they're able to do that, and then they get to pick a decent team for their first knockout round, they could still make top 8. But I think we'll see ENCE struggle to make a big impact once we really get to the upper echelons of the teams at this event. So I hope it works out for ENCE, but there's a lot of things working against them as we go into this tournament.
The Hercules Black have done it! It's a reverse sweep!
The 7th seed features the eagerly anticipated return of Chinese players to Overwatch. LGD.OnceAgain / whatever you want to call them, the team from China, the Hangzhou Spark roster, the team that a lot of people fell in love with after their success towards the end of Overwatch League Season 6, and then their strong performance at the Overwatch World Cup as well, both of which featured them probably overperforming expectations by quite a large margin on Dive, taking down some of the best rosters in both competitions. And while ultimately they didn't win either of those competitions and didn't even reach the final in Season 6, I think they won a lot of fans for the style of play. They're exciting, they're aggressive, they're explosive. They have star players in Gushui and Leave, and even Shy as well, on especially on Sojum. I think they're a roster that lots of people kind of fell in love with over those final 2 tournaments of 2023, and I think a lot of people are excited to see them back and competing in this. There's obviously a big question mark of how well will they do. They've not played a serious competitive match in over 7 months. The last game they would have played would have been that reverse sweep to Saudi Arabia in the grand finals of the World Cup. One of the big changes they've made since coming back was, of course, the introduction of Rush, a coach who has been very successful in his own right, winning Overwatch League Season 5 with the Dallas Fuel. But while the team is a team of good players and the coach is clearly an accomplished coach, there is a question, but as Rush is Korean and the team is Chinese, how well will they be able to gel? How well will they be able to communicate? Especially in a hero ban system, which can put the teams and the coaching staff under quite time-pressured situations in terms of figure out what to ban next, what comps to play, what to do if they do X, what to do if they do Y, what if they do Z. How will that work in a situation where presumably a translator is involved and they're having to try and get these, especially some of the more complicated or nuanced ideas across in a short space of time? So a big question mark there, but at least on paper, good team, good coach. Can't go that wrong, hopefully. The biggest strength, of course, is the dive competition from this roster. They've shown that in the Overwatch League, they can go toe-to-toe with some of the best dive rosters available in that season. And likewise, even at the World Cup, they actually had a lot of success playing dive into the SIG BAP type compositions from Saudi Arabia. And I think in reality, China will feel like they missed a big opportunity and a chance to win the World Cup with how that series went in the end. But with the dive composition, they've shown they can reach the dizzying heights. Any team of the world is attainable for them in a dive mirror. The problem is, in a system like the Esports World Cup, there are hero bans. There's lots of heroes you can take away now. Really do move a lot of these players off their best heroes. What if you take Winston away from Gushui? He could play Doom, but can he do the same things as consistently into the same type of comps? You can take Ana away, you can take Brig away. You can take all these heroes away. It's fair to say maybe in the DPS lineup with Leave and Shy, they actually have pretty good flexibility, even if it were to lean the same way as the Dallas Major in a double flex DPS meta. But outside of that, maybe their flexibility is a little bit more limited. Not in terms of they can't play the heroes or they aren't competent on them, but in terms of the level they will need to reach to go far in this competition. Remember, it's not just, do you have an okay Lucia or an okay Orisa or an okay Sigma? It's, well, you might have to take on someone who's elite at this hero. Can you compete once you get to that level? And I think that's maybe where we'll see LDG really fall a little bit short. In the same way we've talked about a few teams like ENCE and such and how they're quite limited to a few compositions they can really excel at, the same is true for LGD, even though it's fair to say the map pool is more dive favoured, I think, on balance, and there are maybe more different versions of dive that are viable, even if you take some of the heroes away. I think there's still the big question of how do they handle and how do they adapt to this? Because as much as we maybe talk about teams like Space Station Gaimin and say if they get the right meta, they can really excel, LGD are really in the same situation as well, where they need dive to be pretty much viable in most scenarios to stand a chance of going very deep in this tournament. So we'll have to see how the meta settles. It's certainly true that they probably will just have some maps where they're heavily favoured on because of that, or if they can get the right heroes through. Again, because the hero bans only allow you to ban a hero once per series, you can take Winston away from Gushui, but you can't keep it away from him. And same is obviously true for all teams, but it means LGD might be able to get a pretty decent amount of maps on some version of dive or another, even if it's not their preferred version. It's also fair to say there's been a lot of talk since, especially Overwatch League Season 6, about teams just opting into the dive mirror when it's clearly the best comp for this core of players. Will that actually cause a lot of teams to shift away from this? Will we see even some of the elite Korean teams who do fancy themselves on dive actually start to lean away from having dive matchup or enabling dive matchups and just try and find a different way around them? Don't give them the chance to play their best heroes. Don't give them the chance to hit the best form in the biggest tournaments of the year, because they have a reputation, there's precedent for them doing that quite consistently. So it'll be interesting to see especially how the Korean teams approach a team like LGD, if they choose to still think they can win the mirror, or if they just try and take another route round them altogether. I imagine we might see ones where they maybe test the waters on a dive map early on, and then they have the option to lean away from it later in the series as well. On balance, though, it's quite hard to know exactly what to anticipate and what expectations to have for this roster when they've not played in any sort of serious format for a very long time. We saw a leaked scrim, but that was right after they started scrimming again. They didn't look that good, but that should be expected, considering they'd only just started scrimming. So they've actually been scrimming for quite a while since then, and obviously, while everyone is boot camping in Korea to get into the good scrim bubble, LGD have had access to this the entire time, so you have to imagine they've actually leveled up quite a lot in that period of time. Have they used this time to expand away from dive compositions, give themselves more option in a hero ban world, or are they really going to be putting all their eggs in that dive basket and just trying to work around it as certain heroes are banned? We'll have to wait and see. In terms of my expectations for them, as much as this team can hit dizzying heights and take on the best teams, I think in a world of hero bans, it actually hurts their ability to get in these mirror matchups on dive as much as they want. And I think also teams might be a little bit more wary of doing it after some of the problems teams had doing this in Season 6 of Overwatch League. So I think while they'll probably still get top 8, I think they've got the quality both in player and ability to do that. I'm not sure we'll see them go much further in the tournament or reach the top 4. But it has to be said, it is great to see Chinese Overwatch back. This is the roster that everyone loves the most. They've had the most success of any Chinese core ever. They're really very much legends within their own country in terms of Overwatch. So it's exciting to see them back. I'm sure they'll play dive, and I'm sure they'll be pretty damn good at it.
The Florida Mayhem are your 2023 Overwatch League champions!
It's been a year of dominance and disappointment for the Toronto Ultra. While regionally they've been the top dog, they've beaten all the teams, blown them out of the water and won in convincing fashion at every opportunity. Their first big opportunity to compete internationally, which is why this roster was put together, they were massively disappointing. They only finished 6th, or joint 5th/6th. They lost to ENCE, they lost to Crazy Racoon, and they really didn't perform to the level they would have expected of themselves. So this tournament for them at the Esports World Cup is a huge chance for redemption. They're only going to get 3 shots at competing and proving themselves internationally this year, and they've disappointed in one, and this next one at the Esports World Cup will be the biggest one of the 3. So, a big chance for redemption. When we look at this roster being built, it had the choice of some of the best Korean imports, the selection of the best talent from North America. It was really built to do a lot better than it has done, at least in its first showing at the Major. There's been a lot of discussion about why it didn't go so well for Toronto at that event. And there's been a lot of theories thrown around. One thing that's been discussed quite a lot is obviously the level of practice available in North America when Toronto are so far above the rest of their competition is quite a limiting factor. To be the best, you often have to practice and play against the best. And without that, it's certainly a bit of a handicap for Toronto compared to, say, some of their Korean counterparts who have a very robust team full of, or a very robust region full of a lot of most talented teams. But going into the Esports World Cup, they are doing a bootcamp in Korea where they will enter that scrim bubble with all the best EMEA teams, minus ENCE, and as well as all the Korean teams, and of course LGD, the Chinese team, who are also competing from there. So that should hopefully negate some of the issues, even though it's only a week. You can get a lot done in a week. So I think that should hopefully alleviate some of those issues for Toronto, but I think there is maybe a more fundamental issue of they just underperformed, and only really the team will be able to tell you and figure that out and hopefully be able to fix it for this time so they can really show some of the potential and promise this level of roster should have. Because in reality, it really is a very talented roster. You look across it, it's got 3 Overwatch League champions, Sugar3 and Vega, who are 2 of the standout North American talents. It is a team built for success. Likewise, they have a lot of resources and they have the facility, a lot of opportunities that aren't available to a lot of the other Western teams and even not to some of the Korean teams as well. They have talented players across every role, and I think flexibility has to be their biggest strength. And we've talked about flexibility a lot during the course of this video, as it's going to be even more important with hero bans. And we've talked about a lot of the rosters who have flexibility and the ability to play every comp. But lots of rosters do this by having quite big rosters, having multiple tanks, having free DPS, having free support, stuff like this. Toronto have the same level of flexibility, but contained within just their 5 players, which means while other teams can play any comp if they put the right roster in, Toronto can play any comp, but also swap to any other comp within the space of the same map, which even some of these more stacked teams don't have the same option to. And likewise, when you look at how this core of players in Someone, Merit and RuPaul have had success in the past, it was on Florida Mayhem playing a very counter-swappy style. And I think this really seems to be the path to success for the Toronto Ultra at this event as well. The person who gets the most credit for enabling this type of style has always been someone, the tank who can play everything, the leader both in-game and in terms of individual performance. But I think a player who doesn't get enough credit for their flexibility and their ability to play every role they're asked is RuPaul. I think he excels at all the flex support heroes, is most certainly the most well-rounded flex support in Western Overwatch right now, and it's a huge part of why this roster can do so many different things so well. Often I think RuPaul gets left in the shadow of someone because someone has such a big personality and a big reputation. Overwatch League MVP, of course, in Season 6. But I think RuPaul is a fundamental part of that as well. The other side of this, being able to play everything, is the classic idea of a jack of all trades, master of none. While they might be able to play a lot of comps, will they actually be able to beat any of teams who are maybe more specialised or more focused on that? They might be able to beat all the EMEA teams on dive, but how would they do when they play against the elite Korean dive teams, and vice versa? How will they do if they have to take SSG or in a brawl mirror, or if they have to sig mirror ENCE? How will that go for them? It feels like they could be outclassed in some of these situations, and when we think of the map pool as well, are there some maps where the counter swap style isn't quite possible because it is just too dive favoured or too brawl favoured for them to utilise another comp? These are problems that the coaches will have to solve, and the nature of playing a counter-swapping style does put a huge amount of responsibility on the coaches, as well as the players, to have this huge and broad level of knowledge of how to play against all these different situations, especially when you add in the chaos of hero bans to complicate the situation even further. So it certainly is a big ask of the players and of the staff to try and utilise this style, but you have to say it does seem like their best path to success. One thing we should highlight as well when we talk about the flexibility, there is one particular role or one particular archetype where they maybe do struggle, and that is if it's a double flex DPS composition, kind of like we saw a lot about the Dallas Major, then maybe Merit doesn't stack up to a lot of his counterparts. So they either need to get more out of Merit on these roles, which is quite a hard thing to do because it's a very difficult role and a very stacked role as well, or they maybe need to find ways to utilise the hit scan more often or get Merit onto these heroes that we know he can carry on. Again, a potentially difficult situation, but one that hopefully they're able to work around. The biggest issue, or the biggest concern, I think, for Toronto Ultra is obviously the fact that the Dallas Major performance was so underwhelming. I think Vega was a player who took a lot of criticism. I think, upon reflection, while a very poor series against Crazy Racoon with some really devastating mistakes that set his team back, I think while they still lost that ENCE series, I felt Vega performed more solidly overall. Maybe not still the best we've ever seen from Vega, but it felt more consistent. And considering the Crazy Racoon match was his first real match at a major tournament, we're discounting the Twisted Minds one for obvious reasons at the Dallas Major, I think it's fair enough to give him a pass in that one. And while Vega still needs to prove himself and prove he can compete on LAN, on the stage, in these big moments for his team, I think I'm willing to give him a pass for that previous event, and hopefully he can perform here. A couple of the other players who felt like they underperformed was actually Sugarfree and Someone, who are normally such big parts of Toronto's success. I think Someone struggled particularly on Mauga. Obviously, Someone does normally end up pretty good at most heroes and has had time to work on this, and likewise, we don't even know how much Mauga will be in this event, considering some of the recent nerfs, so maybe that problem sort of solves itself even meta-wise. Sugarfree felt like he underperformed slightly compared to how much impact he normally has for Toronto. I think the big question for someone like Sugarfree is when we've seen him dominate and be very successful within the realms of Western DPS players, we really want to see him go on and reach the level of some of the elite players. So you look at someone like Kevster, or you look at obviously the elite Korean flex DPS like Heesang, Stalker, Proper, all of this. Toronto really are reaching as high as possible, so to do that they need to compete with this level of players, and I think that's the sort of step up for Sugarfree. I think especially when we look at non-Tracer heroes, can he reach the same level if there's still the same amount of Pharah or Echo being involved? And that's a big question, and if he can vote, that will be a huge boon for Toronto, and I think will be essential in their success at this event. While pointing to a lot of the individuals, I think really it was an entire team underperformance. It didn't feel like Toronto played the same way we've seen them play regionally, or even the same way we've seen them play in scrims, and especially since we've seen them scrim ENCE and SSG in the past before. So it did feel like a team underperformance, and this is the biggest problem for them to solve. If they can't solve this, it doesn't actually matter how wide their hero pool is or how well they utilise the bans. If you underperform, you won't win. And I think when we talk about expectations for this team, with the resources used and the imports they had and the quality of the roster, really have to be looking towards the top end of this. Qualifying for the event or getting top 8, this isn't what his roster was built to do. It was built to compete to win these tournaments. And it's hard to win these tournaments. It's single elimination. There's loads of other top teams, Falcons, Crazy Racoon, ZETA, SSG, all of this. There's loads of top teams, so winning isn't a sure thing for any team by any means because of that, but they at least want to be competitive and in the running for it. Despite that underperformance that we talked about, and despite some of the issues they've had, I still have a lot of faith in this roster. They're clearly very talented players. I think a hero ban system suits them very well. And if you had to get me to put my money where my mouth is, I think Toronto could even finish top 4 at this event, which I think would be a big achievement and certainly a big improvement based on how they did at the Dallas Majors. So, while there's a lot of questions and problems for Toronto Ultra to solve, I think they have the quality of player to answer those questions. They just need to perform when it matters, and that'll be where I think everyone's attention will be focused on going into this event.
Let's fucking go! Let's go!
Best and the worst.
Oh, that's cool.
In 9th seed is the Gaimin Gladiators, formerly known as Team Peps, and for a long time in EMEA, the Gaimin Gladiators were very much the tier break team. They would beat most of the competition, but when they played the elite teams, they would often find themselves on the wrong side of a 3-0. This was at least until the Face It playoffs, the qualifiers for this event. They were able to beat SSG for the first time, and then even had a very close series against ENCE. It is worth mentioning that SSG, in the match they lost, had just come back from a break. It was relatively low stakes for them. And a week later, SSG did spend most of that series spawn camping the Gaimin Gladiators to really assert their dominance and that they are very much still the best in the West. Despite all of this and the ups and downs and the drama of all that, I think it is fair to say the Gaimin Gladiators are starting to reach a closer level to ENCE and SSG than they have shown historically. But you have to really ask yourself, how much of that gap have they closed, and will it be enough to make a significant dent at this tournament? That's the big question for the Gaimin Gladiators. I think when we watch them play, I think there's lots of things to really like about them. I think they have good setups, they have good ideas, particularly in maybe some of the more complicated multiple ult fights, 8 ult, 10 ult type things. And they have a good feel for the push and pull of a lot of these compositions. And I think that's where we really saw them have their most success, in the Malga composition in the Face It playoffs, and obviously playing a lot of that in a mirror situation as well against a lot of teams. So it's clear that they can excel in one particular form, but with the nature of how this tournament's going to go, 1, the meta might be more open now. 2, with hero bans, it's going to be certainly less stable map to map and game to game and opponent to opponent. So the idea of having one long meta that you can keep refining, get some really nice ult executions or set plans for how to use certain things, that will become less of a factor, or at least much harder to do as consistently across every matchup. So some of the things we've seen Gaimin Gladiators excel in might be less prevalent in the Esports World Cup. Not to mention, of course, the fact that there is going to be loads of stacked teams there as well. I think one of the things that holds them back, and this is probably ultimately true of a lot of teams that find themselves in a sort of middle of a pack situation like Gaimin Gladiators, is why we see lots of good things for them, clever ideas, nice execution. We also see a lot of what could really be classed as basic errors, where they just mess up the ult execution, or something just goes wrong before the fight and they just end up giving away free retakes or cheap points or stuff like this that really ultimately will hold back a team from ever competing with the elite teams at the top of each region, and certainly at this event when we have the top teams from all the regions. It's a problem that's quite easy to diagnose, but often quite hard to fix, especially when the lights are bright and you're on stage in front of a crowd and all of this. So the proof really has to be in the pudding for the Gaimin Gladiators, even though I think there are a lot of reasons to be positive about this team. I think Zodiel has been the standout performer, the emerging star on this team. The Spanish Hitscans player has really taken EMEA by storm, put in a lot of good performances, certainly matching and even outclassing some of the elite Hitscans that they have in EMEA. But I think for Zodiel, while he has done this on occasion, to be truly considered one of the top Hitscans in a region, you have to do this every single time. You look at the top Hitscans in any region and it's a super high level of consistency. There's a lot of talent on Hitscan in the world, and on their day, anyone can probably beat anyone, but it's all about consistency on these roles. And I think Zodiel, while he has shown signs of promise, hasn't reached this level consistently to really be considered in that elite category yet. But the good news for Zodiel is at the Esports World Cup, he will get plenty of chances to play against elite Hitscans and hopefully be able to prove himself. Certainly a player to watch, though, a fun player to watch, and clearly a lot of talent. Likewise, his DPS partner Naga, I think, is another underrated part of the Gaimin Gladiators. I think while a lot of people have been putting attention on Zodio, I think Naga has been quietly and confidently getting on, playing all the roles his team has asked of him, and having a large impact. I think Naga was ultimately, I don't know why this keeps happening to him, he was underrated on Paris as well in the Overwatch League. But I think he is actually a really competent flex DPS player, a smart player. I think he contributes a lot to their game plans and their understanding of the game. And I think if Gaimin Gladiators want to cause upsets or go deeper in this tournament, maybe than a lot of people expect, they need Zodiel and Naga to be in top form. I think these are the key players. If they can overperform or if they can hit good form at the right time, they are the players who can really elevate this Gaimin Gladiators side. And it's a lot to ask, but it's the biggest event of the year, so it's the time to do it. Another player who ultimately probably has quite a bad reputation in terms of performance is FDGod. I think after a disappointing season in Overwatch League, he's very much been sort of labelled as a bit of a liability on main support. But I think so far this year, watching a lot of the games when they were Team Peps and more recently when they become the Gaimin Gladiators, I think he's actually been one of their most solid performers. Admittedly, all of these performances will be on Lucio, which will come into question in a hero ban world. But still, I think you have to give FDGod credit for putting in these solid performances. I think the mistakes have eased out of his game, and he's really performing at a high level than we've maybe seen him do before. So, again, a lot of things are going Gaimin Gladiators' way, but it's whether it's really enough to make a significant dent in this tournament. The biggest concern, obviously, has to be how they will do in a meta that's less stable. We've seen them excel when there's time to figure stuff out, time to refine things, but what they do in a more chaotic situation where each team might change it in a different way with hero bans? How will they work around that? How will they adapt and how will they perform? Obviously, they might be quite good at it when push comes to shove, but we'll have to wait and see, and certainly is at least a red flag going into it. Other than that, maybe the weakest performer so far. We've talked a lot of praise over a lot of players, but it feels like potentially Yoham has been the weakest performer. Obviously, originally the backup flex support was called into action with Crook not being available and having internet issues for long periods of time. It's unclear if they will stick with Yoham or they'll bring Crook in as the starting flex support, but it certainly feels like an area that had a few more mistakes and sort of late Suzus, poor ults, things like this, that maybe caused Gaimin Gladiators issues. So I don't know if we'll see Crook back in the starting lineup or how that will work, but we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, it's worth mentioning as well, while they do have 2 flex supports, so a double flex support comp might be on the cards if they sub out FDGod. Other than that, their flexibility is very much contained within the roster. So Zodiel can play some flex DPS. Tread does have a pretty wide range of tanks, but obviously still has clear strengths as well. I don't think you'll be really looking to see Gaimin Gladiators put Tread on Winston and maybe Zodiel on Genji or something too often. While they're heroes that they can play, I don't think they ever want to find themselves mirroring one of the teams that excel at those compositions. So while the Gaimin Gladiators do have pretty good flexibility within the roster, I don't know if they can really punch up on those heroes. I think they need to try and find a meta that suits them, that allows them to play their best heroes, and that's the way for them to succeed. So it might be a little bit tricky for them, especially with bans and some of the maps, to find the best way around some of this. The other thing that's worth talking about, of course, is the mental side of it. I think there were definitely issues with overconfidence post that SSG when it certainly felt like they were happy to gas themselves on Twitter, and you should be confident in yourself. You should be the most confident person in yourself, but it felt like maybe they got a little bit carried away and maybe they were ultimately humbled a little bit. But it's important that they come into this tournament with the right mindset, because while they want to come in and win every game, they are coming in very much as the underdogs. There's a lot of elite teams here, and while they did finish 3rd place in EMEA, there's a lot of elite Korean teams. The competition in EMEA is actually still quite fierce, even though they finished 3rd in that particular tournament. So I think they need to come in with the right mindset here. Now, the idea is they need to punch up in a lot of these fixtures, especially when we look at the group they're in, alongside Toronto Ultra and Crazy Racoon. These are punch-up fixtures. And as such, they're likely going to finish 3rd right in their group. So if they're going to finish 3rd, it means they don't get a choice of their opponent in their first elimination game. So if that happens, they're probably going to be picked by someone who fancies playing them, who thinks they can exploit them in some way. So it could be quite a tough tournament for Gaimin Gladiators. While they are a team that are trending up overall, I don't know if the trend up has made enough progress for when this tournament's going to happen. So realistically, I think they'll go out in the first elimination round, so they're in that sort of like that 9th to 12th finish. I think if they get top 8, I think that would be considered a good result for Gaimin Gladiators, and they can be very happy with that. So expectation-wise, I'm not sure we'll see them get past that round 1, but I think if a lot of things go right, if the meta suits their players, if they can get Zodiel and Naga in top form on the right heroes, I think that's their way forward. We just have to wait and see how the meta unfolds and how they choose to approach it.
Twisted Minds are just going to run away with this one. The new kings of EU have been crowned.
From the heights of the World Cup victory and the victory in OWCS Stage 1, it really felt like this Twisted Minds core was destined to have a very dominant year in a post-Overwatch League world. But after losing key players in the form of KSA, Kellex and Slay, the roster has gone through a period of turbulence. It's become a revolving door for players to come in and out, and as such, the results have fluctuated massively as well. The latest changes see Kellen leaving the roster. Kellen only wanted to do one more tournament, the Esports World Cup, but the Twisted Minds organisation was looking for something a little bit more long-term, so have instead chosen to bring in Saudi prospect TVNT to try and bring him up to the standard. TVNT is a player who's really only had success so far in the Saudi E-League and had a pretty disappointing year on ROC Esports with that Checkmate Izayaki iteration that just went nowhere. While he's a player with a lot of talent, a lot of ability, particularly on Sigma and Orisa are probably the two heroes he's demonstrated the most ability on, it's an unproven talent. It's an unproven talent, and I think especially compared to Kellen, a less flexible option as well, which we'll talk about more later. But first, we should talk about the other addition to the roster, which is Bliss, who comes in for Crispy. Pretty much a like-for-like swap. Bliss has a little bit more flexibility. We've seen the occasional Ana from him over in OWCS Korea. Though, in general, again, Bliss hasn't had the strongest of years and was ultimately available because he was moved to what seemed like a pretty permanent bench position on that Yeti roster, and that became Fnatic. So, with these changes, we've not seen this version of Twisted Minds perform in an official setting before, so we don't know exactly what we will get, but it's fair to say, so far with all the roster fluctuations in a post-KSA, Kellex and Slay world, the results have fluctuated massively as well. We've seen some particularly good performances as well. We've seen some classic bits where Quartz will just become the server admin, or where UB will find a way to play a very aggressive tempo and that causes other teams problems, but we've also seen some horrendous lows. We've talked about the peaks of certain teams in this video, but while Twisted Minds have a pretty high peak, the trough for how badly they can play actually seems like a bottomless pit. They've put in some of the worst performances compared to the talent on their roster I think that we've seen this year. Some things that are really disappointing to deal with. So, what version of Twisted Minds we're going to get, I don't know. The fact that they've gone for a boot camp in Korea, what seems like a last-minute arrangement to try and catch up with all the other teams and match their boot camp efforts going to Korea as well, that seems like a positive sign. It seems like it should hopefully give them a chance to play against the best teams, and reportedly they've also been playing against Korean teams even before this boot camp, but just playing on pings. So it's possible they've actually had a pretty good scrim bubble, a pretty good practice environment and level of opposition they can play against, and hopefully that's allowed them to integrate Bliss into the team, but also really upgrade TVNT, because I think when you look at this roster, it's TVNT who probably needs the most help and the most work to fulfill that potential. While we have to talk about TVNT as a potential issue, I think it's worth highlighting his strengths. One, he's going to have bags of enthusiasm. This is his biggest opportunity yet. He's going to be surrounded by players with more experience with him. He's going to have a player like UB leading him and telling him a lot of what to do so he can focus on just being good at what he's good at. It's also worth saying TVNT very much fits the KSA archetype in terms of hero pool and hero strengths. While maybe not on the same level as KSA on as many heroes, it does mean Twisted Minds might be forced to return to some of their old glory days, some of the Simcom, some of the Maycom, some of the brawl-heavy stuff that they've had so much success with. That's where they've had their highest peaks, and maybe it's not the worst thing in the world if they get forced to play more of that. Obviously, the flip side of that is it does mean any sort of version of Winston or Bull comps that they were playing with Kellen, and the bright spot of that Kellen version of a roster was Kellen and UB when they were on Winston Tracer, and the value they were able to get as a dive duo. So it's unlikely we see any version of that, but overall, maybe shifting back to a more brawl-heavy and more ground-based series of compositions won't be the end of the world for Twisted Minds. It's also worth talking about the format, because while they might be vulnerable to hero bans, what is true about hero bans is while it gives a lot of influence for the coaches in the series in terms of setting up the viable matchups and what might be possible for their teams, what it also does is it creates a huge amount of variation game to game, opponent to opponent, map to map, which means having a setup that Twisted Minds have where their main cooler, the brains behind everything they do, is Yubi, who is in the server and able to call all these things live and solve these problems live for them, can actually be a massive buff for a team that has such a unique calling style with so much of it being revolving around one single player. It can actually prove to be a massive buff for them in this type of tournament, even if some of their hero pool availability from their players isn't as good as a lot of the other teams. And of course, while we're talking strengths, we have to mention Quartz. While his form has been a little bit patchy this year, especially as of late, as we started getting through more of the different roster iterations, it has to be said, Quartz on his day has the ability to go toe-to-toe and dominate any server. And if Twisted Minds want to have success here, they will need their star player to be their star player. We've seen him go missing in some series, especially in Face It playoffs, I think, most recently. But I think they need the best from their main man at this biggest event. And if Quartz is able to do that, he is actually able to really level up this team to a whole nother plane of potential. So if Quartz can find form at the right time, it would be massive for Twisted Minds. With TVNT coming into the roster, while this might give them a reason to go back to some of their core identity, it also means their strengths and weaknesses become particularly obvious. So if you're a team and you can take away certain heroes like Sigma or maybe Orisa, it depends how relevant it is in the meta, you can maybe put TVNT into very uncomfortable situations. So with a die-favoured map pool, it could put them in a certain predicament, and we'll have to wait and see how they solve that. Now, it will be very much on whether they choose to match it or they can find their own version of the comp, or they try and rely on some of the old stuff just to get them through. Can they just force brawl through, as they so often did at the World Cup as Team Saudi Arabia? Or can they find a slightly different answer that can maybe solve some of these more die-friendly maps? Because you can imagine teams are going to be pretty keen to take them there as often as possible. The other big problem for them to solve is I really feel Vigilante had a pretty decent performance, actually, in his time on Runaway this year, even though the actual team Runaway itself didn't do very well. Since coming to Twisted Minds, it felt like he's had very up and down performances here. Likewise, Bliss is a player who was ultimately benched by Fnatic and also has had a pretty disappointing year, I think, despite Yeti having a few high peaks before they became Fnatic. So there's a lot of question marks about this backline. Will they be able to reach the standard required to compete with all the other top teams in this event? It's hard to say. I'd like to say yes. I think we have seen some good things from Vigilante, both earlier in the year, playing mostly Kiri for Runaway, and also obviously historically back when he first joined the Atlanta Reign in Overwatch League. But that was obviously quite a long time ago, so I think certainly a lot of questions around this backline and what we're going to get out of them. Given all the chaos and changes that have followed Twisted Minds around recently, I think it's really hard to have particularly high expectations for them at this tournament. While I think they will get out of groups, I can't see them going much deeper. Now, saying that, we have to obviously factor in that Twisted Minds do have a reputation for sometimes just really putting on a stellar LAN performance when the expectations weren't particularly high. And while a lot of that roster has changed, it still has Yubi, it still has Quartz, two of the star men from that time. So it's not impossible, and if they can find a style that really suits them, if I think about the success they had in OWCS Stage 1 and the success they had at the World Cup as Team Saudi Arabia, it was actually playing mostly one archetype of comp, mostly Brawl, and just finding a way to play into most things, and doing a lot of creative stuff with Sim or with Mei, and playing a very aggressive style in general. So with TVNT, they might be forced back to a more similar style like that, and if they can get that going and Quartz can find top form, you never know, right? You never know, maybe they can cause some upsets. But I think maybe compared to the original Twisted Minds roster at the start of the year, where we might have been talking about how high can they go? Can they upset the Koreans, etc., etc.? I think realistically for this version of the roster, given how recent a lot of the changes are, out of groups, maybe round 1 if they can find a comp that works or they can find form at the right time. But realistically, I think it should temper expectations for this team.
That is going to do it. M80 has secured themselves a spot in the Esports World Cup.
Our 11th seed is M80, a team that have played second fiddle to Toronto Defiant all year. But at the Dallas Major, they put in a pretty reasonable performance. They ended up coming 5th/6th alongside Toronto, and if anything, actually gave SSG a closer game than Toronto were able to give ENCE. So it seemed like things were trending up, at least for them, but then the roster kind of imploded. Everyone quit/retired/left the roster one way or the other, which meant they had to bring in Kluge, Tree, and Spectra, who are actually pretty reasonable signings when you look at the talent pool available. I think particularly the DPS lineup. But ultimately, what this came with was also a shift to playing less and practicing less. So especially going into the Esports World Cup, where we see so many teams going over to Korea and boot camping, We even see teams going to Finland or Florida to boot camp as well. M80 seem to be ramping their practice down in a time when everyone is ramping it up. So I think especially when you factor in hero bans and the added complications and getting used to these new systems and adjusting to playing a much larger range of comps, it kind of demands a larger range of practice in a lot of ways. So by not having that, it's hard to see how M80 aren't going to fall quite significantly behind a lot of their counterparts. But we should also talk about some of the strengths of this roster, because I think particularly their DPS line is very exciting. I think Tree is a player who has been hyped up for so long, has put in really good performances in contenders, and while they were underage for the first half of this year, finally coming of age, getting to play against all the other top players playing right now as well, I think a great opportunity. It's a bit of a shame, honestly, that it's in a roster that seems to not be putting in the same amount of effort or the same amount of prep as all the other teams. But in terms of raw talent, the snippets we've seen of Tree in Face It playoffs really demonstrates he's worth the hype. And I think when you factor in as well, now he's been being primarily hit scan so far, but also has the option to play over flex DPS heroes, that makes him a very good selection in a hero ban meta. And when you pair that with Spectra, a player who we've not really seen too much of this year, but did have a very good second half of the season in Overwatch League Season 6 with Toronto, and the little bits we've seen from them in Face It playoffs so far, at least when they're actually trying, have looked pretty good from Spectra. So I think Spectra and Tree are actually a DPS line that can go toe-to-toe with most DPS lines at this event, maybe with the exception of the top teams. So I think they're super high talent, really got the ability to carry this roster, and if this roster does anything, I think it will mostly come through Tree and Spectra. Likewise, I think the backline's actually been pretty reasonable. We've seen UV and Lyre play together for quite a while now compared to the rest of the roster, and they seem really solid. I think compare that to a lot of the other backlines, they have reasonable flexibility. Lyre obviously will mainly be going for it between Lucio and Brig, but you can only ban one hero per map and only once per series, so it feels like it's probably enough to get them through, especially with the type of comps they like to play, mostly based around that Sigma. So I think actually UV is been quietly consistent as he always has been for this team. I think Lyre has actually had a pretty good year, despite sometimes the reputation that people try to give him. And you factor in Lyre is also doing most of the calling for the team, it seems like they've at least got a solid system and a solid backline to support the strong DPS. The weakness, of course, probably has to be Kaluj, who I think is the player who is playing the least out of everyone. We've really only seen him play Sigma so far in the Face It playoffs, and it's very much felt like they're kind of just going to do or die on that Sigma hill. And then when you factor in that it's going to be a hero ban tournament, there's an option to work around this. The map pool is quite dive favoured. It's a really bad time to be just a Sigma player or only playing these type of comps. We have seen Kaluj play Winston in the past, but again, you look at the standard maybe of some of the dive teams at this event, and it maybe seems like it's not a good path for M80 to go down. So it feels like, combined with a lack of practice and combined with a limited hero pool, it could be a really rough one where teams look to exploit Kaluj quite a lot. And I think when we think bigger picture, the nature of the bans makes everything messy and complicated, and there's different things to factor in, and there's different ways to play certain maps and when to use bans, when not to use bans. It takes quite a lot of practice and quite a lot of getting used to. It's very complicated and confusing, and having limited practice going into the event, I feel like this is going to be the biggest problem for them. Alongside the map pool probably not favouring the type of comps they like to play, issues being outside that Korea bootcamp scrim bubble as well. There's lots of things going against M80. So when we look at the expectations we should have for this team going into the event, they've maybe got a little bit fortunate with their group. As much as they have to deal with ZETA Division, who will probably play Fearless and dive them a lot, they do get to play against ENCE, so there might just be a bit of a handshake Sigma mirror across the board, which will probably suit Kaluj more than anything else, though you have to say, for my money, Vestalo is the better Sigma, and that would be in top form, heavy practice. So when you factor in that maybe Kaluj has played less and Vestal has been ramping up the practice at the bootcamp, it feels like even in the Sig mirror you would expect ENCE to be better than M80. But in terms of getting past Bleed Esports, I think the quality of the M80 roster is still more than enough to get them past Bleed. As much as Bleed had a bit of a run or got a couple of maps in the Asia LAN, it really has to be said that the quality of the M80 roster should be enough to see them through, but I don't see M80 getting much deeper than past round one. I imagine they'll actually be one of the teams that the second seeds are pretty keen to draft quite quickly, especially if they have a dive in their pool and they can try and exploit that against M80. So I don't have great expectations for M80 because of a lack of practice, because of a lack of prep. I like a lot of their players, but I don't think this is the event or this is the team that they're going to really excel on.
It's all coming up Gala this series.
The 12th seed is Virtus.Pro, a roster put together specifically for this tournament. From the old ex-Oblivion core, they added key pieces in Gala, Sauna, and Rajaro. Rajaro maybe being the most surprising name, never really been on a top team before, but it's put in a lot of good, consistent performances so far for his team. And really, they burst onto the scene by upsetting ENCE in the FACEIT qualifiers for this very event. Since then, they had a very close game against SSG, a narrow loss that also, again, added a lot of hype and momentum to this team. But once it got to the actual FACEIT playoffs themselves, they did find themselves 2-0 up against ENCE in the upper bracket before getting reverse swept once ENCE went dive. Likewise, when they went to the lower bracket, they ran into Twisted Minds, who also played dive. That was the Kellen version of Twisted Minds, if you remember. And they eventually qualified as the 5th seed by beating ROC Esports, but it certainly was a pretty disappointing finish, considering how that tournament started for them. A lot of that success did come through their main support, Gala, who in reality is actually a flex support who can also play Lucio. The inverse of what most teams have, which is a Lucio player who can play a couple of other heroes. So when they can get Gala on Illari specifically, they can play a very certain style, and they can play it to a much higher level than most other teams can. And because they are focused on this one style, it also means teams don't get a lot of chance to practice against it or adjust to it, and we certainly saw ENCE suffer the consequences of that as well. The big problem, obviously, for Virtus.Pro is they kept losing to dive very recently, and if we look at some of the teams that will be at the Esports World Cup, well, there's going to be a lot of good Korean teams who are good at dive, and there's going to be a Chinese team that's very good at dive, and Toronto Defiant are not half bad at dive either, so they really have to solve this problem or find a workaround to enable them to compete on those maps, especially when you consider the map pool is actually pretty dive-favoured as well. Of course, though, they have actually gone to a bootcamp in Korea, so if you want opportunities and chances to practice against dive, South Korea is a pretty good place to go, so hopefully they can solve those problems and make themselves more competitive in those matchups, because they're definitely going to run into it. I think especially considering how poorly they've done against it, teams are going to be eyeing that matchup and licking their lips. So they have a great opportunity, and probably the best opportunity they could ask for to try and solve this problem, but it's one of those ones that is much easier said than done. Another thing that will of course help them against dive is that hero bans will be in place. So while they might have to cop an Illari ban at some point in the series, they can also ban away key dive heroes. So I think there's a very important battle for the team to get right in terms of, can they enable Gala to get Illari on the maps where Illari can really take over, and can they take away some of the key dive heroes that a lot of teams have started using to try and shut down this double flex support composition. Obviously the bans are important for all teams to get right, but I think especially for teams like Virtus.Pro who have a clear strength and a clear weakness, it's much more important to make sure you can play your strengths in the key places and minimize your weaknesses wherever you can. Obviously, trying to help them get the most out of their bans and the most out of their team is their addition of Smash as head coach. Smash, of course, is from the LA Gladiators, where he had a lot of success during Overwatch League. And while he has a bit of a reputation, maybe as a bit of a dive specialist as a coach, he's also been very successful coaching Poke, also winning tournaments on that competition as well. So I think he's a really great addition to the team and will hopefully be able to set them up for success in this upcoming event. Player-wise, it's not just Gala who's impressed. I think Sauna and Rajaro have both individually impressed as well while coming into his team. I think Sauna, who has been on the bench for so many teams for such a long time, finally being the main starting flex DPS player, has put in loads of good performances on Tracer. Meanwhile, Rajaro, mostly on Ram and Sigma, again has looked very impressive as a sort of rookie tank. But the problem you have to sort of highlight with this is it has been on those three heroes almost exclusively. Tracer for Sauna and Sig Ram for Rajaro. So again, in a hero ban world where you might be forced to flex around a lot more or have some key heroes banned away, questions might be asked of exactly how deep Virtus.Pro's hero pool is and how they can work around some of these bans coming in. They do have some mitigating circumstances. Obviously, Shockwave is pretty good at flex DPS as well. They also have Cloud on the bench as well, who can play Tracer, and also Mei too. So they have a few options, especially in the DPS department, to move around and play different types of things. And as much as Gala is known as an Illari player, his Lucio has been more than serviceable so far too. So I think there is enough in their hero pool wise to work around the bans for now. If anything, watching back a lot of their games, I think the biggest problem Virtus.Pro had was while they did lots of things very well, and they had lots of clever backline rotations. They were very good at knowing when to apply pressure in one lane and give pressure in the other lane and vice versa, and reading what the other team are doing. While they were very good at this, there were so many fights that felt like they were just gifted away to a silly pick or a goofy death or a pre-fight mistake. And these are the sort of things that will absolutely just snowball series away from you. I think especially when you look at the standard of teams coming to this event, if you're going to give away free fights against some of these top teams, that's enough to lose a map, you know, even if you play all the other fights well, the more complicated fights well. So I think the big problem for Virtus.Pro, as well as all the hero pool stuff, as well as fix and dive, will also be trying to eliminate some of these mistakes from their game. Even though they had that close game against SSG, they still lost. They obviously got reverse swept by ENCE as well in the FACEIT playoffs themselves. So it starts to feel like, while they had that one good result, they've actually failed to follow that up with another good result. So there's another question of, can they perform when it matters most? Because all the games here, all their matches are going to be super high stakes, especially when we look at their group. It's a very tough group. So all these games are going to be super high stakes, and there's going to be pressure on them to perform, both from being on stage and of the scope and the scale of the event as well. So while there's a lot of potential upsides to this roster, especially if they can get their key players on their key heroes in the right places, I think overall they might struggle. I think there's a lot of big questions to be answered. How deep can their hero pools go? Can they find a way to handle dive? How many of these mistakes can they eliminate from their holds and from their gameplay by the time we actually get to the event in Riyadh? Because of all these questions, I think they'll still get out of groups. I think they've got enough about them to get past Nightmare, but I don't know if we'll see them go much past round one, especially when, as much as they have the best situation possible to try and solve dive with their Korea bootcamp, it's a very hard problem to solve, and there's a lot of very good dive teams here. So I think ultimately, unless they get a particularly good meta or something that really suits their style of comp, I think they could be in quite a tricky situation here, and will probably see themselves going out in round one.
Now Urzo's in a little bit of trouble. Pigpen on the floor. Tree's looking at him. My goats.
13th seed overall and 3rd seed coming from North America. The team have gone through several iterations before finally settling on a roster that seemed to do quite well, and they really excel in the Malga comps even as we got into the FACEIT playoffs. However, they did have to remove Ariel from the roster before the finals, and as such, for this tournament, they brought an Infected on loan from NRG, who were the 4th place team, so didn't qualify for the Esports World Cup, and they've been integrating him since. And while you have to say it's probably an upgrade in terms of flexibility of tank heroes, it's probably a downgrade on some of the heroes that Nightmare did so well during their qualification period on, including the Malga and the Ram. So they've gained some things and lost other things, and there's obviously a question mark of how well they can integrate this new player into the roster. I think in terms of the atmosphere and the team culture, I think he'll fit in no problem. It's just how exactly they choose to utilize his slightly wider hero pool. They've also been bootcamping in Florida, which brings you all the normal benefits of a bootcamp. You get to be with your team in person, you get that bonding, you get to focus entirely on the preparation for this event. However, because most teams have gone to bootcamp in Korea, they do find themselves out of the primary scrim pool, instead being left to scrim mostly ENCE, maybe a bit of M80, and maybe some of the other teams that didn't qualify for the Esports World Cup who are still practicing. So without being in this main pool, it obviously comes with a load of huge disadvantages, both in terms of your meta read and your ability to practice against the best teams. When I look at when a team have had success and what I think their greatest strengths are, it really for me has to come down to their ability in these big macro heavy comps to win the ult game. We've seen them even beat the mighty Toronto Defiant at times on maps by playing a better version of the macro than them. So if they can get a meta that suits that and they can do a lot of the same things, that will obviously be what they are hoping for. Aside from that, I think the key stars on this team are probably Seeker and ZETA. I think Seeker has very much been a star as a North American hitscan player for a while, and certainly did the business for Nightmare in their qualification campaign. Maybe more surprising or lesser known was ZETA, who came in and put some particularly strong performances, especially on Pharah and also on Genji, to help them through their qualification as well. And I think ultimately, if anyone's going to be the star for this team, it will be Seeker and ZETA, but really, the way to win is probably that they're able to play a comp where they can be greater than the sum of their parts. I think pound for pound, when you look at the quality of opposition and the quality of player in this event, they're probably outmatched in most roles. And even with some of their highest peak players like ZETA and Seeker, ultimately those roles are very stacked on other teams as well. So they either need to be able to play a comp where they can out-macro the opposition, or maybe a system where they've sort of out-banned or out-mind gamed the other one in terms of what comp matchup they get. So it's obviously quite a big ask as well, because likewise all the other teams they're competing with will be very much trying to do the same things. I think the key game for Nightmare is obviously their game against Virtus.Pro in Group D. While most people expect both Nightmare and Virtus.Pro to lose to SSG and lose to Fnatic, only one of the two remaining teams can go out of that group, so that matchup against Virtus.Pro is going to be massive for them. Obviously, Virtus.Pro are probably quite happy about it because while Virtus.Pro excel at double flex compositions, they have a big weakness into dive. Nightmare haven't played a whole lot of dive. Maybe with Infected coming in, they can actually utilize that potential weakness from Virtus.Pro. So there's a lot of different things in terms of how that series can go. But in terms of overall expectations, right now I would actually predict Nightmare not even to get out of the groups. I think they maybe are a little bit hard done by, because I think they are pretty close to Virtus.Pro and to Gaimin Gladiators and to M80 as well. And I think if no teams were all to play each other, they could really beat a good few of them at this event. But because of the way the groups work, their group is really hard. So I could see them actually going out in groups here and coming in a disappointing last place. But a lot of that will really come down to how well they can integrate Infected and exactly how well Zero and Seeker can play in this stacked competition. It's worth mentioning as well, as much as we talk about some of the flexibility from Infected, also their backline probably doesn't have that same level of flexibility. Really, Admiral only wants to play Lucio primarily. Z's we've seen mainly excel on Kiri with a bit of BAP. So it feels like their backline might also be quite locked. And as such, you really imagine, while Seeker can play some of the flex DPS heroes, maybe Echo is his best, would much rather be playing hit scan, and that's where his greatest strength lies. So depending on where the meta falls or how the ban goes, there do seem to be a lot of ways to work around Nightmare right now. So a lot of problems for them to deal with, a lot of stuff for them to solve, and especially in many ways, I think being outside the main scrim bubble might be the thing that actually ultimately hurts them the most, especially if you want to try and be ahead in terms of the ban game or the macro game. So I think potentially a very tough event for them, both in terms of hero bans and just the quality of opposition. I think there is a chance they can beat Virtus.Pro. I think that game will be very close, but even if they were to get past Virtus.Pro, I can't see them going much further in the tournament. So round one at best for Nightmare. And I think, to be fair, if they get round one, considering they had to change tank before the event and they've been outside the scrim bubble, that should be counted as success. I think that would be a good achievement for the team. But we'll have to wait and see if they can reach that level. The 14th seed is Bleed Esports, a primarily Thai team with an American tank and a Singaporean main support, who qualified not directly, but they actually qualified through getting the bonus spot gifted to the Asia region due to Crazy Racoon winning the Dallas Majors. So not a team that originally expected to qualify and did obviously have to rely on that Crazy Racoon favour, so a team that are probably quite happy to even get to the event. I think when we look at the team itself, I think some of the highlight players have definitely been High Vision, as well as Clear. Clear is primarily a D.Va player, which at the time was very much a rare thing. But with D.Va being buffed, maybe that buffs the team as a whole slightly, and at least can maybe even shift the meta into something that's a bit more comfortable for them. The main weakness for this team is obviously going to be player quality. This is an incredibly stacked event, and historically, this region has never really been able to compete internationally, and I don't know if we've seen enough from this team to think they will break that mold. Really, the only time we've seen this region have a major impact is the Talon Esports of 2019, or really any team from this region that had Patapan on it at any point. This team does not have Patapan on it, so it's really hard, I think, to justify them having a major impact here. Obviously, they did take 2 maps off FTG during this Asia LAN. FTG are now the current ZETA division roster, and a lot has been made of these 2 maps in terms of maybe it proves they're of a similar level. They had to go to map 5. They're competitive with this, more competitive than maybe we saw some of the Western teams do against the Korean teams at the Dallas Major. But I think in reality, these 2 maps in a bubble don't really convince me that the region gap isn't still the region gap in terms of the player quality. So all the sort of inflated hype I think that is around Bleed Esports, it's not coming from the players in the team themselves. I think they have a pretty realistic idea of how this event will go for them, and I think every piece of content I've seen them do, they've been very likeable and very enjoyable to watch. So I hope they have a good tournament, I hope they enjoy it, but expectation-wise, I don't think they have the player quality to get out of groups, and I think even in a group that's actually probably one of the weaker groups in terms of ENCE and M80, I still think the gap in terms of player quality would be too big. So I hope they have a good event. I hope they can maybe take a few maps here and there, but getting out of groups is probably a step too far for them. To the highest bidder.
Nobody exists at the event better than us.
The 15th seed belongs to the Greatest Showmen, the team that qualified through the OCE playoffs, and they absolutely dominated said playoffs. Really, it felt like they had the strongest roster from the get-go, and it certainly turned out that way if you look at any of those matches. On paper, this team has a lot of interesting parts. They have Punk, Color Hex, and Opener, all from Overwatch League, and they have Top Dragon, who's been a pretty promising flex DPS player for quite a while now, and really seems like he could be the star man. I think as well, when you factor in we're going into a world full of hero bans, Punk seems a tank quite suited to that, can play quite a few things at a high level. D.Va's even buffed, maybe you get Punk on D.Va for a little bit. Then you combine that with some of the heights and promise that Top Dragon has shown, especially again considering the meta quite recently, say at the Dallas Major, has lent quite flex DPS heavy. And same again in Face It Playoffs, so if you can get Top Dragon into a key role, maybe he can do a lot for this team and can be really competitive with a lot of the other talented flex DPS at this event. The thing that's really going to hold them back, though, is the fact that they're not really practicing. I think they're taking this event as it comes. They're just going to play it and see how it goes. So I think when you factor in that, one, a lot of the teams are putting in a lot of prep work, a lot of them boot camping in Korea, and there's this new hero ban system, which is quite complicated and messy. It might be quite difficult to really see them closing that gap while putting in less effort and sort of turning up. And hero bans is certainly the sort of thing that if you're not experienced it or you've not seen a few of the pit holes, you could walk into a few problems here and there. So we'll have to see how they deal with that. But ultimately, when we look at their group, I think Falcons and LGD, these are matches they can't really win. The gap will be too big. Twisted Minds, in theory, the gap should be too big. I think when you bear in mind Twisted Minds have been practicing, they've been boot camping in Korea. But we have seen Twisted Minds have some absolutely low lows, especially in the Face It playoffs. So if something like that happens, it could be upset potential for the Greatest Showmen. But I think realistically, what we expect from the Greatest Showmen at this event is to take it as it comes, have a bit of fun, and see how far they get. If they win a map, if they win a series, good on them.
Loaded have done it! They deny and they say the win, and they're going to lock their ticket in to EWC.
The 16th and final seed at the Esports World Cup will be ROC Esports, which is of course a Saudi organisation which have chosen to sponsor pretty much all Brazilian team except for Sloth, who is American. And they qualified through the South American qualifiers, as you might expect. It was absolutely barn burner of a final. They won a 7-mapper, ultimately clinching their spot. And I think, like a lot of the smaller region teams, qualifying for the event was the sort of big win for this ROC Esports team. They're not expected to make really much of a dent or a run or even maybe take any maps off any of the teams, especially when you look at the quality of their group in terms of Crazy Racoon, Toronto Ultra, even Gaimin Gladiators. We talked about this with some of the other smaller region teams, but the biggest problem will just be a gap in player quality, especially when we look at these top teams. But even when we look at some of the lower seeds coming from EMEA and North America, you have to feel there's a pretty substantial gap between them and the players we see on ROC Esports. As such, I think the expectations for this team at the event will be that they'll lose all the games, probably all the maps, but like we talked about with the previous teams, the win for them is qualifying for the event, being the best team from their region, and seeing how they do against some of the best teams in the world, and enjoying the event and the experience itself. So, happy to see the South American region represented again in Overwatch, again at a major event as well, but I think in terms of results, or are they going to upset any one of the groups, the answer is ultimately no, but I'm sure they'll enjoy the experience. So that brings us to the end. We've covered the format of the tournament, the structure, how it will work, how hero bans will work. We've talked about all 16 teams competing. The only thing left to do is get your predictions in for who you think will win the tournament, who you think will overperform, underperform, drop them in the comments. To watch the event itself, it all kicks off on Wednesday, the 24th of July with the group stage. You can watch that on Twitch, but you can also watch the co-stream of the event on my Twitch channel here. I'll be live in Riyadh at the event itself, so we'll be watching all of the games. We'll be catching up with lots of the players and lots of the coaches at the event. It should be a good time and a great way to watch the event and see how these hero bans actually work in practice. So thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all at the Esports World Cup.